Welcome to episode 93 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today's episode is going to take a look at the Holy Roman Empire around the time of the Protestant Reformation. As most of our listeners are no doubt aware, the Holy Roman Empire was a state which existed from the time of Charlemagne until it was dismantled during the Napoleonic Wars in the beginning of the 19th century. The reason for today's episode, as many of our listeners are likely aware, is that this October marks the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation in the Holy Roman Empire, in today Germany. Specifically, it marks the beginning of the conflict between Martin Luther and the Catholic Church. And in light of this, we decided that it would be a good idea to try and kind of give our listeners a primer on what the Holy Roman Empire was, how it worked, and why it was the way that it was, in an attempt to help contextualize these celebrations which are coming up the next few months. Today's guest, Professor Peter Wilson, is the author of multiple books on the Holy Roman Empire, including The 30 Years' War, and his more recent book, Heart of Europe, which is a history of the Holy Roman Empire from its beginnings all the way to its demise at the beginning of the 19th century. And so he's going to kind of give us a political and institutional history of the Holy Roman Empire during this period to kind of help us understand the framework within which the Reformation developed. And as a final note before we begin the episode, remember that the Ask Historians podcast is a listener-supported podcast. If you'd like to contribute to the show, you're more than welcome to go over to patreon.com/AskHistorians. That's patreon.com/AskHistorians to chip in $1 or $2. Every little bit counts. And so with that, let's start the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Andres Pertera, and today I'm here with Peter Wilson, Cicelli Professor of the History of War at the University of Oxford and author of Heart of Europe, A History of the Holy Roman Empire. Welcome.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, nice to be here.
So we've invited Professor Wilson on in part to discuss the context of the Holy Roman Empire in the lead up to the Reformation. Later this year, we'll be arriving at the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation. And one of the key stumbling blocks that certainly a lot of non-specialists, myself included, have come across is that because we don't really understand much of how the Holy Roman Empire worked, it's difficult to really understand the exact way that the Reformation played out, at least in the Holy Roman Empire. So we've asked him here to come on and just try and explain this context and how it works, and just try and give us a basic grounding in the Holy Roman Empire during this period. So, Professor, just before we start getting into the meat of this, I just wanted to ask, what first made you interested in history, both in general and in the Holy Roman Empire in particular?
Oh, that's a long question, really, to try and to answer, I suppose. History, I think I've always been very interested in history, and the Holy Roman Empire in particular, because it is just so baffling and confusing. I mean, you just flick through the historical atlas and it stands out. It's there in the middle of Europe as this colourful patchwork, and every other country is coloured in solid blocks of colour, and so it looks different, and it seems to contain all of these anomalies and things that don't make any sense, and it's just a wonderful puzzle, so it's a great thing to explore.
So in terms of the Holy Roman Empire, we've all heard and you referred to it in your book, Voltaire's famous quip that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. So what was, at least circa 1500, what was the Holy Roman Empire, and was it Holy Roman or an empire?
Well, the Voltaire's quip, of course, is the thing that everyone knows, and it features very prominently in the general perception of the empire as increasingly losing any real meaning. And one of the things is, of course, like any major state, it changes character across its history. So we shouldn't really expect it to be in a kind of fixed entity. To deal with the three words in the title, although I have to already divert and to say that it never really had an official title, and contemporaries use the three words in varying combinations, usually just calling it the Empire. But the three words, I mean, did retain considerable significance. In many ways, their significance had grown in the later Middle Ages as contemporaries were trying to understand what the empire was, as it became gradually obvious that it was somewhat different to other European monarchies. So it was holy in the sense that its primary mission and the basis of its legitimacy was to defend the papacy and the Christian church more broadly. And of course that immediately is a contested area, notably obviously when the Reformation kicks off. It's Roman in the sense that it claimed to be the direct continuation of the ancient Roman Empire, and it certainly incorporated some Roman political practices, symbolism and legal arrangements, and the Roman element in many ways had actually grown over the 15th century as Roman law was increasingly used as the standard basis for imperial legal practice. And it was an empire, but it was not an empire in the way that we've become accustomed to understand empire. When we think of the word empire, we think of hegemony and domination, and we think of a kind of core periphery model which characterizes European colonial empires. So there is a clear state or people that dominate the empire, and they control various peripheral or colonial peoples and areas through some sort of system of divide and rule. The Holy Roman Empire really had never been that, and it certainly wasn't that around 1500, but it was imperial in the sense that it was a very large political space that regarded itself as a kind of civilization on its own, separate and distinct from others. That character of civilization was overlapped with Christendom, which of course was undergoing changes in the 15th and certainly in the 16th century, and it regarded itself as fulfilling a kind of broader function on behalf of Europe as a whole, as a kind of guarantee of political stability and order.
No, that's really interesting. It sees itself as a continuation of the empire, the old empire, the Roman Empire, but at the same time, it's an evolution, as you say, kind of like the Byzantine Empire. That's actually an interesting question. Did the Holy Roman Empire saw themselves as successors, while the Byzantines saw themselves as kind of like just a continuation of it, or did the Holy Roman Empire see itself as a continuation in the same sense as the Byzantines would?
I mean, they both, of course, see themselves as a direct continuation. The Byzantine Empire really was a direct continuation. The Holy Roman Empire, this was a fiction, and it becomes known as the imperial translation. This is a right that the papacy sort of creates for itself, and but essentially what happens in 800 when the empire is founded is that the papacy thinks that the Byzantine emperor is too far away and too distracted, and it isn't really a viable protector, and so they use the excuse of a kind of vacancy in the Byzantine Empire, there's an interregnum, to so-called translate or transfer the imperial title to the Frankish strongman, otherwise known as Charlemagne. And this, in fact, creates a kind of two-emperor problem, because this is the key thing, I think, about understanding it as an empire. I mean, it was a singular political order. It did not recognize anything else as its equal. And both the Byzantine Empire and the Holy Roman Empire have this ancient Roman sort of sense of what constitutes an empire, so they couldn't recognize each other. So the Holy Roman emperors referred to the Byzantine emperor as the king of the Greeks, and the Byzantine emperor has various other labels for them, and of course this is it is a problem. They can't cooperate. The problem gets somewhat worse with the schism in the 11th century when the Greek Orthodox Church becomes sort of doctrinally more distinct and institutionally certainly separate from the Roman Catholic Church. And of course this proves a problem in the 15th century when the Byzantine Empire is really on its last legs and facing extinction from the Turks. And again, there is an inability to cooperate, partly because of this ideological problem that there can't actually be two empires at the same time.
My next question would be, what did, bringing us back to the topic of the lead up to the Reformation, what did the Holy Roman Empire look like circa 1500? Because I would imagine it looks very different from what it did around 900 AD.
Certainly. I mean, it is contracted. It's still Europe's largest state, really, around about 750,000 square kilometres. It includes Italy. One of the big problems of most modern historical maps is that they tend to exclude northern Italy from the empire, although it was within imperial jurisdiction, and it remains so into the 1790s. It was more obviously demarcated from other European states, so it was quite clear to contemporaries that other European monarchies were in no way subordinate to the empire and were fully sovereign and independent of it, and therefore Europe was composed of multiple kingdoms and other forms of state. But all political thinking at the time was still hierarchical. In other words, that while you might belong to a single order, not all the components of that order were equal. And so, although the emperor didn't directly rule the rest of Europe, he was nonetheless considered, or at least considered himself to be, Europe's premier monarch. And no other European monarch has an imperial title at this point. And this is complicated, of course, by the fact that the Habsburg family have come effectively to monopolize the imperial title from the middle of the 15th century. And in 1519, Charles, the Habsburg King of Spain, is elected as Holy Roman Emperor. So we have, precisely at the time when the Reformation is beginning, a kind of overlap between the Holy Roman Empire, which is European, which is rooted in Europe's medieval and Christian past, and with this late Roman heritage on the one hand, and on the other we have the beginnings of European colonial empires, most notably of course the Spanish Empire, and both are connected through the personality and the common rule of Charles V.
I've often seen authors painted as kind of the closest that Europe came to some kind of unification before the modern era.
Possibly. I mean, the contemporaries, of course, were sharply divided over this, and the divisions, of course, grow as various European peoples and authorities convert to Protestantism, which, of course, was not shared by Charles. So you get this spectre of Habsburg, later termed Spanish, of course, once Charles partitions his empire. And we get the Austrian Habsburgs are separate and remain in the empire, and then we have a separate Spanish branch. We get this sort of charge that there is going to be Habsburg or Spanish tyranny, and so these kind of imperial pretensions of the Habsburgs are seen as trying to create a hegemony, and that really is a notion of empire that, as I say, that we're very familiar with today, following the sort of 19th century experience of empire. That wasn't actually a reality. That was more a spectre that was feared by certainly by France, later on in the 16th century also by Tudor England, and also by other countries. But it was, I don't think it wouldn't be fair to say that it was actually close to a kind of unification certainly not in any kind of positive sense that we see associated, say, with today's European Union. Right.
It certainly didn't last that long. At least the unification of Spain, or Aragon and Castile, and the Holy Roman Empire didn't last long. It lasted until it was partitioned, in the 1560s, 1570s?
It's a process that starts really in the late 1540s, and accelerates in the sort of mid-1550s and is essentially concluded with Charles V's death in 1558. That actually, however, didn't entirely separate the Holy Roman Empire from the Spanish territorial and colonial empire, because Spain continued to control territories that were within the empire. So some of the northern Italian principalities, notably the Duchy of Milan, were held by Spain but were part of the empire, and so too were the so-called Burgundian lands, today's sort of modern Netherlands, were also Spanish territory but within the empire.
And since we've come across this question a bit earlier than I'd planned, but I do want to broach a kind of point that I've seen mentioned in the literature, which is that one of the at least an older explanation that I've seen for why, for example, Charlemagne was not that successful is that he lacked the institutional supports, the really the means to hold together an empire of the size that he had obtained by the time of his death. I saw Emanuel Wallerstein mention it in his book on the 16th century, that more or less his critique of this united Holy Roman Empire, Spain under one king, didn't work as well because it lacked basically the means to function as a single polity.
Yes, I mean, this is commonly the charge that's levied against the empire, and is really the sort of excuse that's used to kind of write it out of European history. I mean, the problem is that we're so accustomed to thinking of states according to a model which was defined in the late 19th century, that so states have to be sovereign, so sovereignty can't be fragmented, for example, it can't be shared, it has to be concentrated. We expect there to be a recognised central government that's recognised by the inhabitants of that state as well as by outsiders, and that this government possesses, in Max Weber's terms, the monopoly of legitimate power, and it then exercises that through institutions. So we expect rulers in the past to have been state builders, to have somehow thought that this type of state was a good thing and to set out to create it. And we tend to measure all sort of past states according to this kind of yardstick, rather than actually looking at how they really functioned and whether they functioned in a way that actually served the interests of at least some of their inhabitants at the time. And one of the things about the empire is that it was always decentralized. So the empire's history isn't, in fact, a sorry tale of a once grand centralized empire under Charlemagne slowly disintegrating and fragmenting and becoming separate European countries. Rather, it's a kind of co-evolution of some kind of political centre, certainly one that has enormous symbolic power and is a source of legitimacy and authority, alongside much more localised forms of government. And so where we would expect, say as in the Kingdom of France, or notably in a country that was highly centralised politically like England, that central rule and authority is exercised through a system of a kind of hierarchical bureaucratic, or ultimately becomes a bureaucratic system. In the empire, those kind of functions that are carried out by in other countries by central government institutions are effectively devolved to communities and to what become the various principalities and civic republics characterizing the empire. So they dealt with problems of daily life, resolving issues at more local level, maintaining peace, and also raising resources to forward to the empire to kind of more central institutions for common purposes such as defence or enforcing the peace. And so the empire, in fact, when we actually look at it as a whole and we see how it functions, we got the big problem is if you only look at the centre, you will find absence, because it doesn't create the kind of array of permanent institutions that we do find in other European countries that are emerging by 1500 or certainly by 1600. but instead it creates a way in which these numerous localities and principalities and so forth can cooperate when necessary, and that could actually be quite effective. For example, the empire is able to act according to its own ideology as Christendom's bulwark and hold back the Ottoman Turks, and it does so for 2 centuries. And the Ottomans in 1500 and certainly by 1600 are a true world power with far more inhabitants and resources than the Habsburgs or indeed really for many times the empire. So this, when we actually look at what is achieved, that I think prompts us to actually maybe reconsider our customary way of just dismissing those states that don't conform to what are in actual fact anachronistic political models.
That's fascinating. From what you're saying, we've basically been imposing this model of progress along the lines, political progress being measured solely by political centralization. You seem to be saying, no, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's part of the point.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely, yes. Yeah. We've missed so much of how this actually functioned. Yeah.
Wow. It just as a quick historiographical aside, how recent has this kind of shift in how we view the empire happened?
This is relatively recent, and it's still contested. Not everyone shares this view, but I would say it's definitely been growing since the sort of late 1990s. But opinions are still diverge on this, whether it does justify the term state or should it be called a political system, and there are various other debates like this, and much of it comes down to the type of terminology that we want to use and how we define that terminology. I think when we cut away all of those kind of disagreements, then I think there is a growing consensus that it has been misjudged, and in particular that its story has been told as one of antagonism between a succession of emperors who supposedly try to centralize. They don't. They actually want to achieve a whole variety of other aims, but centralization isn't really one of them. So between these emperors on the one hand and all the various princes on the other, who are supposedly all striving to become separate little mini states in themselves, whereas they're not. I mean, I know we're focusing mainly on the 16th century, but if we go right to the end, when by 1804, when the empire is really quite clearly in great difficulty, and the northern half has effectively been neutralized because Prussia has withdrawn from the war against France, and the French say to the Prussians, well, why don't you become emperors of northern Germany and break off and create a separate state? And they actually say, no, we don't want to do this. Even though the empire has problems, we're still bound within the empire, and this is quite comfortable for us, and we'll just stick with this.
And so let's get into the meat of the functioning of the Holy Roman Empire during this period, during the circa 1500 and the lead up to the Reformation. What is the public peace system looking like, and how does the imperial diet work at this point?
Okay, well, taking those in reverse order, the imperial diet is the forum that develops to enable the various components of the empire, so these principalities and cities, to come together and to discuss common issues and to negotiate with the emperor. So in other words, it could be loosely compared with a parliament, but there are obviously there are some differences. I mean, the key thing with the empire is that these cities and princes are simultaneously also the emperor's vassals, and there is a feudal element, and they are bound within a hierarchy. So the princes, for example, are not all equal. They have different status to the cities, and there is an elite group amongst the princes called electors. There are only 7 of them at this point, and they are the ones who choose the emperor. So this is an elective monarchy, rather like the papacy or the Kingdom of Poland at the time. But there is really, in practice, only one candidate, and that's whoever is the leading Habsburg at the time, because the Habsburgs directly govern. So the Habsburgs are themselves princes of the empire, because they have principalities within the empire, and they directly govern around a third of its territory. So if you're faced with the Turks on your eastern frontier, you choose the Habsburgs because they have a direct interest in defending the empire. So that's, broadly speaking, the kind of structure. So we would call it a kind of mixed monarchy, in the sense that the emperor can exercise authority, but some of the powers he has to exercise in conjunction with agreement either with the electors or with the princes, or with the electors, princes and the cities, and the mechanism for forging those agreements is the imperial diet. And one of the key developments that the imperial diet helps to promote is the public peace, which is declared. There are various medieval antecedents, but in 1495 this is consolidated and declared perpetual, and that basically said that all of these components, they're known officially as the imperial estates, so the electorates, the principalities, the cities, the counties, all of these other recognised components are not allowed to resolve any differences by the use of violence. Instead, they have to put their differences to arbitration through a new imperial Supreme Court, and if any of them do take up use violence, they basically automatically put themselves in the wrong and are outlaws. And the empire has mechanisms for mobilizing forces against them, and one of the key incentives, of course, is that whoever mobilizes to discharge these functions can usually recoup their costs at whoever is branded an outlaw. So this is actually a system that begins by the 1520s to function relatively effectively.
Interesting. This system sounds like I mean, just going back to this idea that you've kind of blown my mind with this, the decentralization is kind of a feature. It also sounds like this system of public peace is kind of also, maybe not directly, but kind of like a solution within the imperial tradition to the problem that the Roman Empire had, which was a series of dynasties which would last maybe 1, 2, 3 generations and then just get overthrown. Here you have mechanisms to regulate the election of emperors, to regulate differences between the members, and it seems like a firm basis for a government, a steady basis.
Yes, it is. I mean, I do have to stress that we shouldn't overemphasize its effectiveness. I mean, like any system, it had its failings, and of course there was a problem of dealing with the so-called free rider problem. I mean, if you were the Duke of Mecklenburg sitting up in northeastern Germany, and there was some dispute going on down in the southwest, you might sort of think, well, why should I bother contributing? I mean, the one of the things that does begin to bind people together is this growing sort of concern over status. They are all very anxious to preserve their autonomy and the status that is a marker of autonomy. So it matters whether you're called a duke or if you're only a count. Those sort of distinctions they become increasingly conscious of, and failure to discharge your imperial obligations raised the kind of possibility that your neighbours might say, well, actually you're not really an autonomous duchy that is formally recognised within the empire. Maybe you're in fact one of our vassals, because we're discharging the responsibilities to the empire instead. So the kind of competition built into the system could derail it at times, but it could also prompt it to function.
Before we get into the immediate lead up to the outbreak of the Reformation and a lot of the chaos that this seeded into the Holy Roman Empire, wanted to take a small aside to ask about the expansion of literacy and the printing press during this period. The fact that literacy is expanding is often pointed to as one of the reasons that you start getting this more bureaucratic state, or more of an evolution of administration in Europe during this period. How did it play out in the Holy Roman Empire?
Okay, I think that's a very good question, and this is one of the interesting sort of areas of current research. I mean, the empire was in many ways one of the most literate and educated regions in Europe. I mean, it has far more universities than any other European country. I mean, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I mean, by about 1500, there's around 20 or something, and there's only about 2 in England, for example, and only 1 or 2 in France, something like that. It's of that order. And the main function of these universities is to turn out literate administrators and officials and clergy, and these people essentially work at the level of the communities and the territories. So they join the princely administrations, which are becoming increasingly bureaucratic. They are shifting over to greater use of written records and new forms of accounting and new legal practices involving written law, for example. Of course, the church has always been associated with writing and literacy too. So you do have this, and of course the invention of printing, which is again within the empire and a major phenomenon of this period, and is very quickly adopted by imperial institutions and by the emperor. So Charles V's predecessor, Maximilian I, is very adept at using print media for Habsburg dynastic propaganda, for example, while the imperial diet is already beginning to publish in print form a kind of digest of its deliberations. So it would be fair to say that this is really, all of this is happening. So to lead into your question, I mean, the development of the Reformation and so on is happening at the time of a kind of media revolution. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say so. And a third, so alongside literacy and education, alongside print, we have a third development which is also emerging in the 1490s, which is the world's, well, certainly Europe's first regular postal service, relying on relays of horses and regular coaching stations, which allows the rapid dissemination of information, including, of course, printed material.
Wow, I honestly had no idea that there was such an explosion of literacy in the Holy Roman Empire in this period. Partly because, you know, as I think you touch upon in your book, a lot of the histories of like Western Europe just kind of say, by the way, the Holy Roman Empire exists. We don't really get into what's going on there. Now that we've kind of set the stage, without getting too much into the theological side, staying more in the political and the military side, when Reformation begins, you start getting this. You've got I think it's Frederick the Wise, was it? Yes. So, and you've got this this disagreement that breaks out. How is it that these institutions that we've been talking about kind of affect the way that the early Reformation plays out?
Okay, I mean, I think actually there's a nice, neat link with your earlier question about writing. I mean, one of the things that we've got to ask ourselves is, you know, why do theological differences create this problem or this development known as the Reformation? Why is it, in other words, that Luther's sort of theological issues with the Catholic Church ultimately lead to this fundamental and permanent schism in Christianity? I mean, after all, there had been theological disputes in the past, obviously in the 15th century with the Hussites, which are within the empire, but going back further in the Middle Ages, I mean, it's not unknown to have these in the past. So why is it then, around beginning of the 16th century that we get this permanent schism? One thing I think is actually the sort of new spread of this, or the rapidity of the spread of this written literate culture. I mean, what the theologians do is that when sort of the Catholics want to talk to Luther and Luther wants to talk to the Catholics, and the starting point is let's try and resolve our differences, what do you do before you go to the meeting? Where you write down what you think your interpretation is. And the use of writing, of course, is intended to resolve disputes by making things more precise and removing ambiguity. But of course, by removing ambiguity, you can also make your differences much more obvious. And this is a major problem with the way in which the political authorities approach the Reformation. They basically say this is a theological issue. Let's leave it to the theologians. But the theologians are not able to reach an agreement. So the problem is then, well, what do you do with this? And so essentially the empire, through Charles V, tries to deal with this through the mechanisms of the imperial public peace. So they say, well, we'll park the theological problems. The emperor Charles says, this isn't a matter for the papacy, this isn't a matter that I can decide, I can't pronounce on what constitutes true religion or not. The Pope must deal with that. But what I can do, and what the imperial court can do, is decide whether the Catholic Church has a right to that monastery, or the right to that tithe, or some other jurisdiction, or whether that can be secularized or can be used for other purposes. So essentially, the dispute is seen as one of property dispute and of public order. And the major issue that emerges with the Reformation is who should control the institutions of the Catholic Church and the resources of the Catholic Church. Because if Luther's trying to work and trying to transform the church, so he and his followers sort of feel naturally entitled to use churches and to have the resources associated with those churches, whereas from the Catholic point of view, this is robbery, and this is a bunch of outlaws who are trying to usurp the authority of the established church and to steal its resources. And so the empire is kind of caught in this problem, that it's trying to manage this, trying to avoid this escalating into violence, whilst always hoping that the Pope will somehow resolve the dispute. But of course, that ultimately fails. I mean, the Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century, which is supposed to resolve the dispute, simply redefines and Catholicism in more precise terms, therefore making it even more distinct from the way in which Luther and the various other Protestant reformers have been defining what they regarded as religion. So the various parties diverge, and so that theological problem is permanently institutionalized in the form of separate churches. So in that sense, one could say that the empire has failed. On the other hand, the empire largely emerges from these disputes by the middle of the 16th century without too much violence. Yes, there is the Schmalkaldic War, some other conflicts in the early 1550s, but there is nothing on the scale of what happens in France or in the Netherlands in the second half of the 16th century.
Wait, so you're implying that while it was damaging, it kind of, the Holy Roman Empire kind of got through it earlier, or that it was less damaging overall compared to the damage the Reformation rent elsewhere?
What the empire does is it adopts a very different solution to the problem of the theological dispute. So in other European countries, ultimately the monarch takes the decision. So this is an enormous increase in secular authority. So Henry VIII, for example, decides that he can determine what constitutes true religion and therefore break with Rome, and so do then a succession of other European rulers. The Danish king does the same, later on the Swedish king, and so forth. So, and they get their theologians to draw up a list of articles, or in other words, a statement as to what constitutes religion, and then they use state machinery to try and ensure that their subjects believe this. The kings of France and Spain and some other countries decide that Catholicism is the true religion, and so they stick with that. But what happens in those countries is, what do you do with the problems of minorities? So in those countries you have a single official faith, and then minorities receive varying rights of toleration. So dissenters or Catholics in England who pay fines because they don't agree with the Anglican Church. Or in France, at the end of the 16th century, we have the Edict of Nantes, which is by special royal dispensation, the French Protestants, known as Huguenots, are allowed to have some autonomy within France. So that's a kind of centralized state solution, and involves an increase in the power of the central state. So it creates the power itself to decide what should be the official faith and what kind of dispensation should be allowed to minorities. In the empire, it's a very, very different situation. In the middle of the 16th century, the Lutherans and the Catholics come to a kind of compromise where they agree that both of them should have equal legal status. This is known as the so-called Religious Peace of Augsburg of 1555. In fact, when you read it, in no way does it define what religion is. They deliberately exclude this. So they don't say what Catholicism is, and they don't say what Lutheranism is. What they do instead is to resolve all of these jurisdictional disputes. So they say that, in your principality, if you want to be Lutheran, that's fine, provided you don't make any further changes to any Catholic churches that still exist at that point. And in that territory, if you want to be Catholic, the ruler decides that yes, we'll stick with Catholicism, then Lutherans have no sort of jurisdiction over that. So it's a sort of demarcation of these various jurisdictions. So in other words, they are within that public peace framework that they've been trying to sort of grapple with this problem since the beginning. And the Peace of Augsburg 1555 is then to be upheld by the imperial court. So if you have any further disagreements, those are supposed to be arbitrated by the court. And that is by and large a system which works more or less reasonably well into the early 17th century, when of course we have the 30 Years' War, and which is an entirely other topic, which will take us far too long to go into that. But in a sense, is a breakdown for various reasons of the imperial public peace.
But that's really fascinating. So really, the institutions of the Holy Roman Empire really did play like this key role in the way the Reformation plays out really does just get molded by the difference between how the Holy Roman Empire had handled its political situation versus all these more centralized states, which, as you say, had this more centralized solution. I had never really honestly thought of it that way. Okay, fascinating. So, I think we've given our listeners a decent primer, because this is quite literally a very large book. There's plenty more to be said, but this is a very complex topic, and that you could dedicate an entire life to studying, obviously. So I just wanted to wrap up with two final questions that are a bit more about your field in general. And my final two questions are: first, what in your mind are some of the major challenges standing in the way of advances in scholarship on the Holy Roman Empire?
Well, I think probably the most fundamental challenge is the one that has always been there, which precisely because it was so decentralized, it never had a single central archive. So, unlike historians working on France or Britain, or indeed even the United States, there is no national archive that you can go to that has all the major documents collected. So there is a fundamental research problem that in order to look at the empire, you can go and look at the records of individual imperial institutions, most of which are now collected in Vienna. But in order to understand it, you have to do an enormous amount of legwork and sort of trundle around all the different regional archives in Germany, which are in turn extraordinarily rich and contain vast amounts of material. So there is a fundamental sort of methodological problem, I think, in that. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
So basically, what are some of the remaining major challenges remaining to the advance of scholarship? So I think that's a pretty major one. That's I mean, is there like a project to digitize those records and try and make them more available?
Yes, there are various projects underway. There are plans to digitize. I mean, partly to digitize the records of the Imperial Diet. Certainly, it would be fantastic to digitize the records of the Imperial Diet once it remains permanently in session, which happens from 1663 onwards. And so you've got about 140 years worth of material there. So there are those projects, but I mean the quantity of material is so enormous. I mean the other thing I think connected with that is that for a very long time there has been this sort of strong tradition of regional history in Germany, and this traces, and indeed in Italy as well, and where you trace the history of Württemberg or Bavaria or Mantua or wherever it might be, as if it was always sort of destined to become some kind of sovereign independent state, and so people have not really looked for the connections between these different areas, either between themselves or between them and the empire, and that remains a kind of gap, I think, which is being filled, but there's still some way to go.
To end on a positive note as well, what are some of the major, in your view, some of the major triumphs of Holy Roman Empire scholarship in the last few years or decades?
Well, I think there is a much more nuanced picture of the empire now. The state of research is really very good, certainly compared to what it was sort of 30 years or so ago. We know a lot more about very important aspects. There is a greater willingness to accept the fact that it is just complicated and defies sort of usual classification, and to work with that and to try and understand it more on its own terms, rather than to sort of shoehorn its history into these sort of preconceived categories or definitions. There is a particularly welcome trend, I think, has been the sort of attempt to actually people the empire. I mean, for far too long it's been, if you discuss the history of the empire, people thought, well, you're only writing about emperors and princes, and it was seen as entirely detached from daily life and the concerns of ordinary inhabitants. And I think that one of the most exciting fields is actually to kind of reconnect those histories. I mean, the fact that the inhabitants of Central Europe had this range of so-called liberties or sort of autonomy and so forth, and were had a kind of degree of self-regulation is down to their sort of belonging to this wider overarching framework, and trying to understand that and trying to put a more social and also economic sort of context to that, I think is one of the kind of current developments, and is really quite exciting.
Great, and I look forward to the advances that we'll continue to see, and that you're obviously a great part of as Heart of Europe, which seems to the push seems to be in part to also spread these ideas to outside of just the academic sphere. and it seems to be doing a great job and seems to have had a pretty great reception. So thanks again for coming on, Professor Wilson, and I hope that we will continue to see more great books on the Holy Roman Empire from you in the future.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Ask Historians podcast, and I'd like to take a moment to thank Professor Wilson once again for coming on to the show and talking to us about the Holy Roman Empire. 2 points in particular from the episode really struck me as important. One is the importance of digitization of archives. This not only applies in the case of the Holy Roman Empire, where obviously Professor Wilson made the point that the archives are strewn around many different archives in what is now multiple different countries, Germany, Austria, but also that this is a problem that affects multiple fields, and in an age when we have the means through digital technology to digitize these records and make them publicly available, more easily available to scholars anywhere in the world, it seems fundamental that we continue to support efforts to digitize these records, and that support isn't just individual contributions, though I do recommend that people contribute to their local archives if you can, but also in terms of pushing local governments to allow digitization to happen and to also put the resources required to digitize massive numbers of records in the hands of archivists. That means not only buying the necessary equipment, but also paying the archivist to make copies of document after document. And as this process of digitization advances, scholars' lives get easier. And when scholars' lives get easier, you also see more advances and in historiography and our understanding of the past. So that seems an important point to emphasize. Feel free to contact your local archives. Maybe you can volunteer. Maybe you can pitch in. Maybe your contribution is sending a letter to some local politician who may not think that digitization is important. In many different ways, big and small, you are helping historians write history. You are making historians make discoveries. So definitely give it a thought. The other point that I thought important to discuss a little bit was Professor Wilson's point that many historians have kind of imposed this way of interpreting the Holy Roman Empire, which kind of sets itself up to viewing the Holy Roman Empire as a failure. That is, seeing centralization and the construction of a nation state as the only way to measure development in late medieval and early modern Europe. This format of analysis of seeing how Spain and France and what became the UK developed their own particular forms of states with varying degrees of centralized control might not be the best format to understand the Holy Roman Empire, which had a different solution, a different way of evolving, but which we shouldn't assume is the wrong solution. Whether or not you agree with Professor Wilson's analysis of the Holy Roman Empire and its decentralization as a feature instead of a bug, it seems at least prudent to approach the Holy Roman Empire for what it was, and not with the preconceived notions of what it should be relative to the way that other states in Western Europe were evolving at the time. So, thanks again for listening to the Ask Historians podcast. We hope you've enjoyed yourself, and next week we're back with Brian Watson. Have a good 2 weeks, folks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.